have incredibly strong chipper 999 billion% of the time. You have an incredibly strong chipper 999 billion% of the time. How do I have such incredibly strong chipper 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have such incredibly strong chipper 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have such incredibly strong chipper 999 billion% of the time? I have the strongest sharing in 999 billion% of the time. You have the strongest sharing in 999 billion% of the time. How do I have the strongest sharing in 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have the strongest sharing in 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have the strongest sharing in 999 billion% of the time? I am skilled with taijutsu 999 billion% of the time. You are skilled with taijutsu 999 billion% of the time. How am I so skilled with taijutsu 999 billion% of the time? Why am I so skilled with taijutsu 999 billion% of the time? Was I always so skilled with taijutsu 999 billion% of the time? I am skilled at taijutsu 999 billion% of the time. You are so skilled at taijutsu 999 billion% of the time. Why am I skilled at taijutsu 999 billion% of the time? How am I skilled at taijutsu 999 billion% of the time? Was I always skilled at taijutsu 999 billion% of the time? I am incredibly fast 999 billion% of the time. You are incredibly fast 999 billion% of the time. How am I incredibly fast 999 billion% of the time? Why am I incredibly fast 999 billion% of the time? Was I always incredibly fast 999 billion% of the time? I have superhuman speed 999 billion% of the time. You have superhuman speed 999 billion% of the time. How do I have superhuman speed 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have superhuman speed 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have superhuman speed 999 billion% of the time? I am faster than anyone can perceive 999 billion% of the time. You are faster than anyone can perceive 999 billion% of the time. How am I faster than anyone can perceive 999 billion% of the time? Why am I faster than anyone can perceive 999 billion% of the time? Was I always faster than anyone can perceive 999 billion% of the time? I battle with the perfect for 999 billion% of the time. You battle with the perfect for 999 billion% of the time. How do I battle with the perfect for 999 billion% of the time? Why do I battle with the perfect for 999 billion% of the time? Was I always able to battle with perfect for 999 billion% of the time? I make incredibly fast tensi of 999 billion% of the time. You make incredibly fast tensi of 999 billion% of the time. How do I make incredibly fast tensi of 999 billion% of the time? Why do I make incredibly fast tensi of 999 billion% of the time? Was I always able to make incredibly fast tensi of 999 billion% of the time? I move faster than any eyes can perceive 999 billion% of the time. You move faster than eyes can perceive 999 billion% of the time. How do I move faster than eyes can perceive 999 billion% of the time? Why do I move faster than eyes can perceive 999 billion% of the time? Was I always able to move faster than eyes can perceive 999 billion% of the time? I have an incredibly powerful ninjutsu 999 billion% of the time. You have an incredibly powerful ninjutsu 999 billion% of the time. How do I have an incredibly powerful ninjutsu 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have an incredibly powerful ninjutsu 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have an incredibly powerful ninjutsu 999 billion% of the time? I am also well-versed in ninjutsu 999 billion% of the time. You are well-versed in ninjutsu 999 billion% of the time. How am I well-versed in ninjutsu 999 billion% of the time? Why am I well-versed in ninjutsu 999 billion% of the time? Was I always well-versed in ninjutsu 999 billion% of the time? I am incredibly stealthy 999 billion% of the time. You are incredibly stealthy 999 billion% of the time. How am I incredibly stealthy 999 billion% of the time? Why am I incredibly stealthy 999 billion% of the time? Was I always incredibly stealthy 999 billion% of the time? I am well-versed in Bukijutsu 999 billion% of the time. You are well-versed in Bukijutsu 999 billion% of the time. How am I well-versed in Bukijutsu 999 billion% of the time? Why am I well-versed in Bukijutsu 999 billion% of the time? Was I always well-versed in Bukijutsu 999 billion% of the time? I am incredibly skilled with the sword 999 billion% of the time. You are incredibly skilled with the sword 999 billion% of the time. How am I incredibly skilled with the sword 999 billion% of the time? Why am I incredibly skilled with the sword 999 billion% of the time? Was I always incredibly skilled with the sword 999 billion% of the time? I am well-versed in Shurikenjutsu 999 billion% of the time. You are well-versed in Shurikenjutsu 999 billion% of the time. How am I well-versed in Shurikenjutsu Genjutsu 999 billion% of the time? Why am I well versed in Genjutsu 999 billion% of the time? Was I always well versed in Genjutsu 999 billion% of the time? I have perfect aim 999 billion% of the time. You have perfect aim 999 billion% of the time. How do I have perfect aim 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have perfect aim 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have perfect aim 999 billion% of the time? I can hit all targets 999 billion% of the time. You can hit all targets 999 billion% of the time. How can I hit all targets 999 billion% of the time? Why can I hit all targets 999 billion% of the time? Was I always able to hit all targets 999 billion% of the time? I can hit any target 999 billion% of the time. You can hit any target 999 billion% of the time. How can I hit any target 999 billion% of the time? Why can I hit any target 999 billion% of the time? Was I always able to hit any target 999 billion% of the time? I have an incredibly fast growing speed 999 billion% of the time. You have an incredibly fast growing speed 999 billion% of the time. How do I have an incredibly fast growing speed 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have an incredibly fast growing speed 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have an incredibly fast growing speed 999 billion% of the time? I have sleight of hand 999 billion% of the time. You have sleight of hand 999 billion% of the time. How do I have sleight of hand 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have sleight of hand 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have sleight of hand 999 billion% of the time? I have powerful Genjutsu 999 billion% of the time. You have powerful Genjutsu 999 billion% of the time. How do I have such powerful Genjutsu 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have such powerful Genjutsu 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have such powerful Genjutsu 999 billion% of the time? Why am I the best at Genjutsu 999 billion% of the time? Was I always the best at Genjutsu 999 billion% of the time? I can turn other Genjutsu against their users 999 billion% of the time. You can turn cost of Genjutsu against their user 999 billion% of the time. How can I turn cost of Genjutsu against their user 999 billion% of the time? Why can I turn cost of Genjutsu against their user 999 billion% of the time? Was I always able to turn cost of Genjutsu against their user 999 billion% of the time? I have remained with your sharing in 999 billion% of the time. You have remained with your sharing in 999 billion% of the time. How do I have remained with your sharing in 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have remained with your sharing in 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have remained with your sharing in 999 billion% of the time? I have the ability to use CPU only 999 billion% of the time. You have the ability to use CPU only 999 billion% of the time. How do I have the ability to use CPU only 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have the ability to use CPU only 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have the ability to use CPU only 999 billion% of the time? I have the ability to use and cross 999 billion% of the time. You have the ability to use and cross 999 billion% of the time. How do I have the ability to use and cross 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have the ability to use and cross 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have the ability to use and cross 999 billion% of the time? I have the ability to extinguish and cross 999 billion% of the time. You have the ability to extinguish and cross 999 billion% of the time. How do I have the ability to extinguish and cross 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have the ability to extinguish and cross 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have the ability to extinguish and cross 999 billion% of the time? I have the ability to use CC 999 billion% of the time. You have the ability to use CC 999 billion% of the time. How do I have the ability to use CC 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have the ability to use CC 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have the ability to use CC 999 billion% of the time? My eyesight always improves 999 billion% of the time. Your eyesight always improves 999 billion% of the time. How does my eyesight always improve 999 billion% of the time? Why does my eyesight always improve 999 billion% of the time? Did my eyesight always improve 999 billion% of the time? I am the smartest person alive 999 billion% of the time. You are the smartest person alive 999 billion% of the time. How am I the smartest person alive 999 billion% of the time? Why am I the smartest person alive 999 billion% of the time? Was I always the smartest alive 999 billion% of the time? I have the highest intelligence in the world 999 billion% of the time. You have the highest intelligence in the world 999 billion% of the time. How do I have the highest intelligence in the world 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have the highest intelligence in the world 999 billion% of the time? Was I always the highest intelligent person in the world 999 billion% of the time? I am at peak intelligence 999 billion% of the time. You are at peak intelligence 999 billion% of the time. How am I at peak intelligence 999 billion% of the time? Why am I at peak intelligence 999 billion% of the time? Was I always at peak intelligence 999 billion% of the time? I have a calm personality 999 billion% of the time. You have a calm personality 999 billion% of the time. How do I have a calm personality 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have a calm personality 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have a calm personality 999 billion% of the time? I am very insightful 999 billion% of the time. You are very insightful 999 billion% of the time. How am I so insightful 999 billion% of the time? Why am I so insightful 999 billion% of the time? Was I always so insightful 999 billion% of the time? I am incredibly humble 999 billion% of the time. You are incredibly humble 999 billion% of the time. How am I so humble 999 billion% of the time? Why am I so humble 999 billion% of the time? Was I always so humble 999 billion% of the time? I am always accurate with my intuition 999 billion% of the time. You are always accurate with your intuition 999 billion% of the time. How am I so accurate with my intuition 999 billion% of the time? Why am I so accurate with my intuition 999 billion% of the time? Was I always so accurate with my intuition 999 billion% of the time? I am accurate with my theories 999 billion% of the time. You are accurate with your theories 999 billion% of the time. How am I so accurate with my theories 999 billion% of the time? Why am I so accurate with my theories 999 billion% of the time? Was I always so accurate with my theories 999 billion% of the time? I am willing to learn from others 999 billion% of the time. You are willing to learn from others 999 billion% of the time. How am I so willing to learn from others 999 billion% of the time? Why am I so willing to learn from others 999 billion% of the time? Was I always so willing to learn from others 999 billion% of the time? I am great at evaluating things 999 billion% of the time. You are great at evaluating things 999 billion% of the time. How am I so great at evaluating things 999 billion% of the time? Why am I so great at evaluating things 999 billion% of the time? Was I always so great at evaluating things 999 billion% of the time? I think before I act 999 billion% of the time. You think before you act 999 billion% of the time. How do I think before I act 999 billion% of the time? Why do I think before I act 999 billion% of the time? Did I always think before I acted 999 billion% of the time? I always find the fastest way towards peace 999 billion% of the time. You always find the fastest way towards peace 999 billion% of the time. How do I always find the fastest way towards peace 999 billion% of the time? Why do I always find the fastest way towards peace 999 billion% of the time? Was I always able to find the fastest way towards peace 999 billion% of the time? I am incredibly trained in studies of Chippers 999 billion% of the time. You are incredibly trained in Chippers 999 billion% of the time. How am I incredibly trained in Chippers 999 billion% of the time? Why am I incredibly trained in Chippers 999 billion% of the time? Was I always incredibly trained in Chippers 999 billion% of the time? I am well versed in Chippers 999 billion% of the time. You are well versed in Chippers 999 billion% of the time. How am I so well versed in Chippers 999 billion% of the time? Why am I so well versed in Chippers 999 billion% of the time? Was I always so well versed in Chippers 999 billion% of the time? I am incredibly trained in all arts of fighting 999 billion% of the time. You are incredibly trained in all arts of fighting 999 billion% of the time. How am I incredibly trained in all arts of fighting 999 billion% of the time? Why am I incredibly trained in all arts of fighting 999 billion% of the time? Was I always incredibly trained in all art of fighting 999 billion% of the time? I am incredibly trained in the art of 999 billion% of the time. You are incredibly trained in the art of 999 billion% of the time. How am I incredibly trained in the art of 999 billion% of the time? Why am I incredibly trained in the art of 999 billion% of the time? Was I always incredibly trained in the art of 999 billion% of the time? I am well versed in strategy 999 billion% of the time. You are well versed in strategy 999 billion% of the time. How am I so well versed in strategy 999 billion% of the time? Why am I so well versed in strategy 999 billion% of the time? Was I always so well versed in strategy 999 billion% of the time? I am an amazing strategist 999 billion% of the time. You are an amazing strategist 999 billion% of the time. How am I such an amazing strategist 999 billion% of the time? Why am I such an amazing strategist 999 billion% of the time. Was I always such an amazing strategist 999 billion% of the time? I am incredibly strategic 999 billion% of the time. You are incredibly strategic 999 billion% of the time. How am I incredibly strategic 999 billion% of the time? Why am I incredibly strategic 999 billion% of the time? Was I always so incredibly strategic 999 billion% of the time? I am incredibly disciplined 999 billion% of the time. You are incredibly disciplined 999 billion% of the time. How am I incredibly disciplined 999 billion% of the time? Why am I incredibly disciplined 999 billion% of the time? Was I always incredibly disciplined 999 billion% of the time? I am a one-person army 999 billion% of the time. You are a one-person army 999 billion% of the time. How am I a one-person army 999 billion% of the time? Why am I a one-person army 999 billion% of the time? Was I always a one-person army 999 billion% of the time? I am the ultimate shinobi 999 billion% of the time. You are the ultimate shinobi 999 billion% of the time. How am I the ultimate shinobi 999 billion% of the time? Why am I the ultimate shinobi 999 billion% of the time? Was I always the ultimate shinobi 999 billion% of the time? My name is Power 999 billion% of the time. Your name is Power 999 billion% of the time. How's my name Power 999 billion% of the time? Why is my name Power 999 billion% of the time? Was my name always Power 999 billion% of the time? I have incredibly powerful chipper 999 billion% of the time. You have incredibly powerful chipper 999 billion% of the time. How do I have such incredibly powerful chipper 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have such incredibly powerful chipper 999 billion% of the time? Was my chipper always so incredibly powerful 999 billion% of the time? I have godlike chipper 999 billion% of the time. You have godlike chipper 999 billion% of the time. How do I have godlike chipper 999 billion% of the time? Why do I have godlike chipper 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have godlike chipper? I summon things easily 999 billion% of the time. You summon things easily 999 billion% of the time. How do I summon things easily 999 billion% of the time? Why do I summon things easily 999 billion% of the time? Did I always summon things easily 999 billion% of the time? I have reached something like 999 billion% of the time. I have reached something like 999 billion% of the time. I have reached something like 999 billion% of the time. Why do I have reached something like 999 billion% of the time? Did I always have reached something like 999 billion% of the time? I have performed anything single 999 billion% of the time. I have performed anything single 999 billion% of the time. I have performed anything single 999 billion% of the time. What performed anything single 999 billion% of the time? I have performed anything single 999 billion% of the time. I have performed 999 billion% of the time. I have performed 999 billion% of the time. I have performed 999 billion% of the time. Why do I have performed 999 billion% of the time? I always have performed 999 billion% of the time. I have powerful control 999 billion% of the time. I have powerful control 999 billion% of the time. I have powerful control 999 billion% of the time. Why do I have powerful control 999 billion% of the time? I always have powerful control 999 billion% of the time. I have powerful control 999 billion% of the time. I have powerful control 999 billion% of the time. I have powerful control 999 billion% of the time. Why do I have powerful control 999 billion% of the time? I always have powerful control 999 billion% of the time. I break 999 billion% of the time. I break 999 billion% of the time. I have break 999 billion% of the time. Why do I have break 999 billion% of the time? Did I always break 999 billion% of the time? I sensible 999 billion% of the time. I sensible 999 billion% of the time. I sensible 999 billion% of the time. Why do I sensible 999 billion% of the time? I always sensible 999 billion% of the time. I never all 999 billion% of the time. I hate all 999 billion% of the time. I hate all 999 billion% of the time. Why do I hate all 999 billion$ of the time? Did I hate all 999 billion$ of the time? I literally has 999 billion$ of the time. I literally has 999 billion$ of the time. I literally has 999 billion$ of the time. Why do I literally has 999 billion$ of the time? Why do I always has 999 billion$ of the time? I hate 999 billion$ of the time. 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 I never small to tell 999 billion$ of the time. I never small to tell 999 billion$ of the time. I never small to tell 999 billion$ of the time. Why never small to tell 999 billion$ of the time? Why never small to tell 999 billion$ of the time? I never 999 billion$ of the time. I never 999 billion$ of the time. I never 999 billion$ of the time. What am I 999 billion$ of the time? Is that way it's 999 billion$ of the time? I differentiate between 999 billion$ of the time. I differentiate between 999 billion$ of the time. I differentiate between 999 billion$ of the time. What am I differentiate between 999 billion$ of the time? Is that way differentiate between 999 billion$ of the time? I differentiate between 999 billion$ of the time. I differentiate between 999 billion$ of the time. I differentiate between 999 billion$ of the time. What am I differentiate between 999 billion$ of the time? Is that way differentiate between 999 billion$ of the time? I all always 999 billion$ of the time. I all always 999 billion$ of the time. I all always 999 billion$ of the time. What am I all always 999 billion$ of the time? Did I always all always 999 billion$ of the time? I have never 999 billion$ of the time. I have never 999 billion$ of the time. I have never 999 billion$ of the time. What am I never 999 billion$ of the time? I always 999 billion$ of the time. I have never shown that's 999 billion$ of the time. I have never shown that's 999 billion$ of the time. I have never shown that's 999 billion$ of the time. Why do I never show that's 999 billion$ of the time? Did I always never show that's 999 billion$ of the time? I have never shown that's 999 billion$ of the time. I have never shown that's 999 billion$ of the time. I have never shown that's 999 billion$ of the time. What am I never shown that's 999 billion$ of the time? Did I always never show that's 999 billion$ of the time? What are for 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 999 billion$ of the time? Did I always for 999 billion$ of the time? What are 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 for 999 billion$ of the time? Is that always for 999 billion$ of the time? I can still return 999 billion$ of the time. Still return 999 billion$ of the time. What can I still return 999 billion$ of the time? How can I still return 999 billion$ of the time? Is that always still return 999 billion$ of the time? Why do you always earn 999 billion$ of the time? You always earn 999 billion$ of the time. How do you always earn 999 billion$ of the time? Why do you always earn 999 billion$ of the time? Was I always able to earn 999 billion$ of the time? I can use the 999 billion$ of the time. I can use the 999 billion$ of the time. How can I use the 999 billion$ of the time? What can I use the 999 billion$ of the time? Was I able to use the 999 billion$ of the time? I can use the 999 billion$ of the time. I can use the 999 billion$ of the time. I can use the 999 billion$ of the time. What can I use the 999 billion$ of the time? Was I able to use the 999 billion$ of the time? I can use the 999 billion$ of the time. I can use the 999 billion$ of the time. I can use the 999 billion$ of the time. What can I use the 999 billion$ of the time? I always use the 999 billion$ of the time. I really 999 billion$ of the time. I really 999 billion$ of the time. I really 999 billion$ of the time. Why every 999 billion$ of the time? I always every 999 billion$ of the time. I can use 999 billion$ of the time. I can use 999 billion$ of the time.